right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I know everyone's getting tired and ready for the state fair, but this is a very important topic, as are they all. For anyone who I don't know, my name is Lindsay Forson. I'm the Director of Cybersecurity Programs for NASS. I am actually in front of you not for a cybersecurity topic for once, and we are going to be talking today about voting processes for emergency responders, just a project I wanted to be on, so I'm leading for NASS. And so I'm happy to be here with you today. We have a couple of different presentations that we're going to go through. We're going to start with a presentation from the Council of State Governments from Taylor. NASS and CSG's Overseas Voting Initiative have worked on this together. We did research, basically a 50-state scan of what your current policies are around voting for emergency responders, and John Milhofer did the research on the NASS side, but sent me up here. So, and then we have two states who have fairly expansive state legislation in place for expanded voting processes for emergency responders, who are going to talk about their state law and its implementation. And then we should have plenty of time to open up for discussion if you all have questions for them or want to share your experiences in your states. If we have anything wrong in our research, feel free to let us know. We it's always changing, and so be happy to talk about that as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Taylor Lansdale with the Council of State Governments.
Hey, thank you. Oh, thank you for the help. I appreciate that. So as she said, I'm Taylor from the Council of State Governments. I'm a program manager of our Overseas Voting Initiative. For those who don't know about the Council of State Governments, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that represents all three branches of state government. You'll see on the slide here that it has my name and then my research associate, Rachel Wright, who has done the lion's share of our research on our side, and she interestingly enough, we're talking about storms, emergency responders. I think the storm down south right now, the tropical storm, delayed her flight. She couldn't make it. So I'm presenting on her behalf, but I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to her for her great work on this. Also, and again, I just want to thank NASS. It was really cool to work with you on this. Typically, CSG's involvement in elections is specifically with UOCAVA issues, military and overseas voters. We work in collaboration with the Federal Voting Assistance Program. So neat to kind of expand our work as we're working with voters who are away from home. So I guess let's start with why. Why are we talking about state policies and procedures for voting for emergency responders? Well, we're in COVID still, much to all of our chagrin, I think. And then beyond that, you think about the uptick in natural disasters, wildfires, hurricanes on the Gulf Coast and in the Northeast. The amount of people who are emergency responders, and we'll talk more about terminology, but the amount of emergency responders who are deployed out of state, out of jurisdiction to serve us is increasing. So who are we talking about? Well, the definitions on that vary, but just some examples: law enforcement, firefighters, emergency medical service professionals, National Guard, not on federal orders, utility workers, even Red Cross volunteers. And I guess the next question that begs then is, well, how big of a footprint are we talking about in terms of the amount of people that we need to solve for here? Just at the beginning of this month, according to the National Interagency Fire Center, there were 21,000 firefighters, wildland firefighters out in the field, I guess is the term, fighting wildfires. Another example, last year during California's wildfires, they had people responding to their fires from 10 different states, right? And we're just talking about firefighters in these instances. So there is a need, and we're happy to kind of talk to you about what we were observing in the field. So there we go. So looking specifically at state policy, state legislation, we observed 11 states who've passed legislation outlining alternative voting procedures. In terms of range, it looks like Wyoming may have been out in front of it in 1998. The most recent piece of past legislation that we have was in Virginia in 2020, but worth noting that there is a bill in both chamber of the Minnesota legislature right now that I think has been carried over. Something on this slide to note as well, California's on here twice. Interestingly enough, and we'll talk more about that, the first bill in 2009 was dealing specifically with California emergency responders dealing with in-state, and then they followed that up in 2013 with a bill taking care of those who are serving out of state. So another observation, when you look at this center mass or the bulk were passed in 2013, well, why is that? We're led to believe that that's because that was after Hurricane Sandy, the year after Hurricane Sandy. There have been severe flooding throughout the U.S. due to other storm-related events and wildfires throughout Colorado, Oklahoma, and Washington State. So obviously, in terms of that, the emergencies driving the response to it, obviously we're in a time where maybe there's a need for other states to be evaluating this again. Just a cool quote, and I mentioned earlier, California has a bifurcated approach to this. Then Secretary Bowen had this to say: in situations like last summer's 2008 wildfires, firefighters and medics and other emergency responders are sent out without little notice. AB 1440 ensures that these men and women have the same opportunity to participate in their democracy when they drop everything to protect us. Great quote. That's now California Election Code, Section 14313. All right, state procedures. So breaking down a little bit deeper into what we've observed in terms of the approaches that states are taking. 4 states, and we're actually going to hear from 2 of them here with New Mexico and Mississippi, have taken the approach of extending UACAVA procedures. Obviously, there are some benefits to that. Obviously, your procedures to some extent are already built out. You think about ballot transmission, communication, and so on and so forth. I'll certainly let the secretaries talk more about their approaches there. The second approach that we've observed was focused on the extended period for ballot request, right? So New York, am I still on the right side? Yep. So New York and Oklahoma essentially allow for an extended application for a ballot, right? And I think operative statutory language without regard to deadlines for the receipt of absentee ballot applications. So if you think about the solution that we're trying to solve for, right? So say a emergency responder, say like a line person or a line worker out of Kentucky needs to go to respond to an emergency in Ohio, right? That person has missed the opportunity to apply for an absentee ballot. They're not going to be able to vote in person because they're going to be out doing great work on behalf of those other citizens. So that meets that intent, right? That solves for that. I've mentioned already that California takes the bifurcated approach. Interestingly enough, for emergency responders who are deployed in state, and I apologize for using the word deployed, but who are being used in state, they're actually allowed to cast a provisional ballot in the jurisdiction in which they find themselves working. If they're serving out of state, then they can request a ballot beyond the typical deadline. And then wrapping up just the perspectives, the approaches, then there's just giving general authority to the Secretary of State. Administrators go administer and take care of this. Seems to be the language. For example, Alabama's language directs the Secretary of State to adopt an emergency rule to allow those qualified voters to vote by absentee ballot. So for talking just very briefly about defining who qualifies as an emergency responder, and obviously this can get a little tricky because sometimes when you're talking about, obviously there are kind of your bellwethers who you think of, the firefighters, the line workers, but then maybe something like the Red Cross volunteers might not typically be considered. There's an organization out there called Team Rubicon who deploys veterans to go help in emergencies like this, would they qualify, right? So maybe a little bit to think through here, looking specifically at the different terminology: emergency services workers, trained and certified emergency response providers, emergency responder. Worth noting, only 4 states actually defined in statute the term. New Hampshire was the only one to actually break out examples, and their examples were law enforcement, firefighters, emergency medical service providers, National Guard, utility workers, Red Cross, but even then they actually included a catch-all, right? Kind of talking about what I just mentioned, this idea that maybe there are some people out responding that we wouldn't traditionally think of. Wrapping up, important to take a look at declaring authority. If we're going to say that people are responding to an emergency, who's indicating that there is, in fact, an emergency? The majority approach, more than half, lists the governor as the declaring authority. About half also include another state's governor. 5 include language from the president. Obviously, there's some overlap. A declaration from the president. Obviously, there's some overlap here. We have some unspecified, and then we have some other language that's a little more general. Specifically, you look at New York, which uses the phrase court of competent emergency, and Virginia, which uses the phrase an appropriate authority. Oh, let's see. I have my slides out of order. I apologize. Or have I jumped to somebody else's? Yeah. Am I going backwards? Yeah. Hey, awesome. Here we go. Well, the good news is we're done. So, again, want to thank NASS for the opportunity to do a little more research on this. Certainly, if we can be of assistance to you and your jurisdictions, please feel free to reach out, and we'll do what we can to help. I think next we have the Secretary from New Mexico.
Thank you. Thanks, Lindsay and Taylor, and thank you all for being here this afternoon. I'm Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, New Mexico Secretary of State, but you all know that. My election director, Mandy Vigil, and I are going to give just a brief presentation on what we've done in New Mexico to provide voting access for our emergency responders. And I'm really here just at the front end to offer some color commentary on how this all came about. Our statute, which I know you're going to immediately Google, is New Mexico Statutes Annotated Section 1-6B-9. We originally passed this legislation in 2015. At the time, I wasn't Secretary of State. I was the county clerk in Bernalillo County, which is the largest local jurisdiction in New Mexico. And we had just come off a 2014 general election in which we'd had, like many Western states, a number of wildfires throughout the state. A number of our local firefighters and hotshot teams were, to use your term, deployed not only throughout the state in other counties in which they are not registered voters, but also across the country to assist with wildfires in other locations as well. We had a number of firefighters, local law enforcement officers, and other first responders deployed to other states in the wake of other natural disasters that year, such as hurricanes. And at that time, as a county clerk, dealing directly with the voters and trying to provide opportunities for them to be able to cast their ballot, felt very hands tied to be able to assist many of these voters who had missed deadlines or timelines in which to apply for an absentee ballot. And of course, and Kim Wyman knows this, when you're a county clerk and someone's pleading with you to be able to help them get a ballot and your hands are tied by statute, especially somebody who's a first responder out there trying to protect the lives of others, it's just a heartbreaking feeling. To not be able to accommodate them the way we can accommodate our military and overseas voters, right, who don't happen to be around. And often, these individuals, when these emergencies happen, they don't have any notice, right? They're expecting to be at home and to maybe early vote or vote on election day, but they get the notice maybe 24 hours, maybe 48 hours in advance that they are going to have to go to a different county or a different state to assist with a natural disaster. So it's not like they're being irresponsible. They just, they're being called up and they're being called to duty. And so we felt very strongly, our County Clerks Association at that time, that we needed a tool in our toolkit to be able to assist these brave individuals out in the field and having their voices heard at the polls. And that year in 2015, I was the lead lobbyist for our New Mexico County Clerks Association. And so working with our regular sponsor in the state legislature and others, we did manage to get this legislation passed. You can skip. So this provision, again, was created to ensure that emergency response providers could participate in elections while temporarily stationed away from home. And over the years since it was originally passed in 2015, it has aided New Mexico FEMA workers, firefighters, forestry service, and homeland security personnel, as well as other first responders. We, again, are very proud of this provision. It's been very helpful. It's been functionally modeled after UOCAVA. We do have a UOCAVA provision in our state statutes as well, and so we have basically expanded who can participate utilizing those provisions under the context of being emergency response personnel. And so with that sort of history and background, I'm going to hand it over to our state election director, Mandy B. Hill, to kind of talk about what exactly does it say and how does it work in New Mexico.
Thank you, Secretary. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. So as the Secretary mentioned, we do have a specific provision. I think it should be up there so we can save you a little Google time. But essentially, we have modeled this in the same way so that we can assist our voters as if they were an FQE or a federal qualified elector. So if you are an emergency response provider, and we do define this, it is a kind of a general definition, but essentially if you're temporarily assigned either by a government or non-government relief agency or of an employer so that you can support victims of an emergency and go ahead and assist in rebuilding infrastructure, that sort of thing, those are the individuals that would qualify to go ahead and apply for a mail ballot under this provision. So we'll get into a little bit more as to what are some of the details. So the emergency must be declared by either the president or our state governor. The individual must be called to order within 35 days of the upcoming election, and then it must call for them to be out of their county of residence. So a couple of exceptions to the UOCAVA provisions is that they're not able to use the FPCA or the FWAB to apply for their ballot. So a little bit more about how does the exact system work? What is the voter going to experience through this? They should have the same experience as some of our military or overseas voters. So again, once that emergency is declared, we do provide on our online absentee application portal the actual option to select emergency service provider. At that point, then the county clerks would receive that request and go ahead and process it accordingly. They would have the opportunity to provide that voter the ballot electronically, and the voter will have the opportunity to return it electronically if they so choose. So we need to do some outreach to give folks this information. As the Secretary mentioned, it is a reasonably new provision when we're considering how many emergencies have we actually had ordered within that time frame. And so, the governor has filed an executive order. We made our local county clerks aware of that situation, and then they are going to go ahead and be the ones to work at the local level to get some of that messaging out and actually do the processing and interaction with the voters. During this past 2020 election, as we all know, it was one of our tools to be able to utilize during the pandemic situation. And so I think that it was really helpful. And we made sure that our county clerks had that information as soon as we did. We went ahead and updated website systems so that the voters would also have all of the information to go ahead and apply. I think the Secretary touched on this, but what we saw is that the individuals that took advantage of this opportunity were mainly healthcare workers who were temporarily stationed away to support the COVID-19 pandemic. and also just, law enforcement or individuals involved with supporting a response to the voters, to New Mexicans. Election administrators across the states, also, we find that we can utilize this provision more regularly as we're dealing with wildfires. So that's something that we experience in the Southwest, as you all have an awareness of. So it's going to be something that I think will be an excellent policy and be able to assist us in supporting those voters during those times. What we did discover is through this first kind of big round, if you will, some opportunities for improvement and ways that we expect to be able to grow this policy is just working in particular with our emergency response agencies, making sure that they can assist us with messaging and identifying any areas in which we can do better as far as technology or just getting that information out to these individuals that may not even know it's something that they can take advantage of. Additionally, just working with our local county officials and making sure they feel comfortable with the process that they're not using all of the time, and understanding how they can also support that messaging and getting that information out to those in that short window of time when something's coming up unexpectedly. And with that, be happy to assist with any questions.
Thank you very much, Secretary Chulas-Oliver and Mandy. Are there any questions that are New Mexico specific? Okay, so we'll just go ahead and open up at the end then for discussion and questions. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Secretary Watson from Mississippi and Stephen Stiglitz, who's come up from Mississippi Power to join us for this conversation. Take it away, Secretary
Thank you,
Watson.
Lindsay, and thank you to my New Mexico counterparts. Really spending the time on the procedural piece. I want to spend more time really on the story and what this looks like on the ground. I know back in 2014 when this passed in Mississippi, my predecessor, many of you remember Secretary Hoseman, brought it to the legislature, and I remember I was in the state senate then and kind of thought through it many times. Those of us who were legislators before we got to the secretary's office, in policy sometimes we become wonks and we just look at the policy side and we sometimes forget there is a face to this story as well. So we had an experience last year that really put the face on this provision for me, and I understood the importance of it. Out of that, I called Lindsay and a few others and started talking about this is something that we just saw in Mississippi that I didn't see a whole lot of reciprocity across the country, something that we need to address because this is real. This impacted a ton of folks in this last 2020 election. Not only did we have, obviously, the presidential, we had COVID, but in Mississippi, we had a hurricane that hit 6 days before the election. And we had 5 of our southeast counties without a lick of power. Not a single one of those precincts in those 5 counties had power all the way up until about Thursday night, Friday night, when we started talking to Mississippi Power and others because we realized the light bulb went off. Wait a minute. We've got all these people from North Mississippi. Stephen will tell you from 17 other states. Entergy had folks coming in from, I think it's 20 plus states. So there were folks just flooding into Mississippi to help us get power back on so we could vote. And that really meant a lot to me, seeing the face of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the procedural piece, but let me say before we get started, Rachel and Taylor have done a fantastic job walking through kind of the research, and then I don't think this thing would have as much legs as it does without Lindsay. So publicly want to say thank you, Lindsay, for taking this on and really driving this. I love seeing collaboration and I love seeing this work on the policy side. But again, I wanted to give a face to this, what we saw in Mississippi. So we'll go to the next slide there. And again, the humanized side of it, you can see that the procedural piece, we expanded it in 2014. Obviously, UOCAVA, we worked in that same model and just added our first responders to our UOCAVA provisions in statute. You'll see that in just a minute. We're on to the next one there. Allows access to request on a register to vote through the federal postcard application, much like, again, UOCAVA, again, same process. And I think one of the things we saw there was by simply expanding the UOCAVA procedures, our clerks were familiar with it. So they knew how to operate already. We didn't have to teach them anything new. So it was a seamless expansion there operationally. You'll see on the next slide our list there, eligibility, and you'll see there 1, 2, 3, 4. The 5th one down clearly is where we see our emergency responders added to it. The process on the next slide, again, this is the speedy piece of it. I want to tell you more about what it looks like, but that's our process in Mississippi. Again, much like New Mexico and several other states, there are a few differences, but that's what we do in our different states. What works in Mississippi may not work in New Mexico, but that's the beauty of the 50 laboratories of freedom. So you'll see the process there. On the next slide, we really start getting into what we saw after the hurricane hit. Hurricane Zeta, many of you recall, again, a lot of press on COVID, on the election, and a lot of folks kind of forgot, wait a minute, a hurricane just hit, and we've got an election in 6 days in Mississippi. So seeing the power out, not just at precincts, but in people's homes. I'm from South Mississippi. I'm from Pascagoula, which is on the water. So I know what hurricanes do. And I really think there was some divine intervention in that, me being the Secretary of State at that time, at that place, understanding what a hurricane means. And then adding to that the fact that, wait a minute, there are folks that need to vote. And I know what it looks like when a hurricane hits when you don't have power. That's one of the things that you kind of forget. And oh, by the way, we got folks coming in, bringing their equipment, bringing their men and their women to service to get power back on so we can return to life. And by the way, this election's on us. And so it really all kind of culminated at the perfect time. And so I remember, back in 2014 when we passed this, I never really seen it in practice, but now being Secretary of State, understanding that provision was in law, got to kick into overdrive. And so, after the hurricane hit, clearly we were getting prepared. I called Mississippi Power, Stephen Stiglitz and his crew, our co-ops along the coast, as well as Entergy, and we started thinking through this. What does this look like? And our first call was, wait a minute, we've got to get power back on. And clearly we hadn't seen a hurricane that close to an election in South Mississippi. And so Stephen will tell you here in a second, they had to reprioritize. Where do we need to get power first? So I got all of our circuit clerks in those 5 counties. We were on a text thread together, back and forth. Hey, send me a list of your precincts, locations. We need to get these to our power providers to make sure that they're going to get there and get those precincts powered up. That was the first thing we thought of. And then it kind of hit, wait a minute, they're going to need people that are coming from other parts of the state and country to make this happen. What about them? They need to vote. And as was mentioned earlier, at the drop of a hat, they don't have time to go through the process. That doesn't happen. There's no timeouts. Let's go. So we really started thinking through this and again, talking to all of our providers, what does this look like on the ground? I mean, you got folks coming in from all other states, which then started triggering me making phone calls to you, many of you who I talked to during that process. And I remember talking to Secretary Lee. She says, look, we'll get people to meet you in Alabama halfway. We'll figure out a way to make this work. And then so we started thinking, well, wait a minute. Some of these provisions that don't apply to other states that could apply to other states would make this so much easier. So again, walking through this, we'll kind of tell you how this works. You can get that next slide. And this was really the difference that we saw was the priority of precincts. And to that point, they did a phenomenal job, Stephen and his team, our co-ops. The Monday night before the election on Tuesday, all but 2 precincts are powered back up. And then Tuesday morning at 7 a.m. when polls opened, every single precinct was powered back up. They did a phenomenal job of making that a priority because that's democracy. That's what we do. And it became, amen, it became a team sport where, gosh, this has to happen. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. Power's got to be on. This precinct's got to work. We were looking for generators. We were looking for what is the backup plan. And so they did a fantastic job and playing such a role in making sure that folks could vote. So we worked through that. And then as we saw folks all over the country coming in, folks from North Mississippi down on the south into the state, we started talking to our clerks and to our providers. And they started getting this list. Hey, we need lists of people. Where are they from? I'm going to call their secretary from their state. I'm going to call the clerks from the counties of Mississippi. Here is the law that we passed in 2014. Here is how it works. We had our election crew draft, step by step. Hey, here's the process. We emailed that to all of the responders who were on the ground. They got that straight to their iPhones. We did it for iPhones and Android. So through our provisions, they were able to receive instructions, receive their ballot, process everything through on their phones in the field. I mean, they were all over the place. You couldn't get them mail because they didn't have power. They were in different spots of Mississippi, depending on where the emergency was at the time. So having the access with their phones and electronically through email made such a difference. But the thing that broke my heart was when I called certain secretaries around the country and they said, we don't have that. And I had to think, wait a minute, this is a huge election. And these men and women who dropped everything to come help us in Mississippi just lost their chance to make their voice heard. And it just made it real to me. This is a legit issue that we've got to tackle across the country. And this is one of those things that, yeah, the procedure could be different because of the Fifth Degree Laboratories of Freedom. But this is an idea about democracy that cuts across the board. Every single state should have this provision. It may look a little different in your state, and that's fine. But we've got to protect these first responders who, at the drop of a hat, drop everything to come rescue us in our time of need. And not only was it our time of need for life, but it was our time of need to go vote. And they made that happen, Stephen and his team and others. So it was just an incredible experience. You can click through that, or that's really the story. But again, just thinking through the whole process and the timing of it, we've got 2 storms now bearing down, coming to the Gulf, a tropical storm that Secretary Lee and John, you're going to deal with it as well, probably you more than me. But that in mind, clearly we don't have an election right now, but with that in mind, you never know. And we're seeing so many more of these things, hurricanes, fires, tornadoes, you just don't know. So having these procedures on the front end, making sure that we're ready for the next election, is just something I strongly encourage you to take a look at and talk to your legislature. They will understand this issue. This should be an easy, no-brainer issue. These are our first responders that drop everything for us. This is the least we can do to make sure they can vote. And I had not just Stephen, but other of our providers would call and say, I can't tell you how excited these folks were when they figured out that they could vote because they thought they lost that opportunity. But that now they can cast a vote in this incredibly important election. They're just overjoyed. You have guys on the side of a telephone pole, up voting, and hopefully they weren't doing that, but who knows where they were. But they were so stinking excited that they had that opportunity because our law was in place in Mississippi. And I hated for, again, those other states that didn't have provisions, sorry, you just can't vote. And it really woke me up and put a face on it. And so I called Lindsay and said, we've got to do something with this. We've got to tackle this. So I just implore you, the processes, again, can look a little bit different, but the issue has the same face. It's your men and women who are making a difference in other states, across the country, and it's something that they deserve. So I just encourage you to take this with you when you go back and get your legislatures to move forward with it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. He really saw it on the ground, kind of how it worked, what his employees saw, what those from other states saw, and really continue to put a face on the whole thing.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary, and thank y'all for allowing me to be here today. As the private sector member of the panel, I want to share, I like to think that for our industry and for my company, each event, each storm, each situation creates learning opportunities for us. And in my 29 years, this is the first time that we've had a restoration event that coincided with a significant storm event. Significant to the point, for us, my company represents the southeastern portion of the state, about 185,000 customers, 23 counties. In Katrina, we lost power to every customer. Zeta was a relatively small Category 2 storm. We lost service to over 94,000 of our customers. So what was expected to be a somewhat minimal storm became much more impactful. And when we get to that point, the way the process works is you'll put resources out of state, in-state and out of state, on call. And then depending on the amount of damage and where it is, those resources will be allocated out. So in a lot of situations, a first responder from another state they know the opportunity is there, but they may never get called. And vice versa. They may not have expected it, but they get moved somewhere entirely different. This storm caught us by surprise, and like I said, we like to learn from the experiences we review. We do post-restoration reviews just to see what was missed, what could have been done better. This is the first time I can ever recall voting being a part of a post-restoration review. I will tag on to what Secretary Watson shared about the relief, and I'll use the word joy, that a lot of these folks that were down there helping us restore power experienced when they found out they could cast a vote. On the flip side, for those who had worked so hard to identify their employees, that was provided to Secretary Watson and his team, reached out to the home states to find out they couldn't vote. There was a great deal of disappointment with those folks. Did not change their effort, did not change the work they did. There was just disappointment that they weren't going to be able to exercise it right. So for us, so my company is a subsidiary of Southern Company, based out of Atlanta, Georgia. We rely a lot on our sister companies in Alabama and Georgia. But for this storm restoration, we also had crews and tree trimmers from 17 additional states. They range from the Midwest to the Northeast to Florida and across to Texas. So it was a very widely represented group. And like Secretary Watson mentioned, the first issue was, oh my gosh, 6 days, there's a major election coming. What can we do? And I will tell you the prioritization of restoration of power after an event like that, it does not deviate very often. But in this situation, it deviated. We want to make sure that it was not impacted. And like he indicated, that experience led to the fact of, oh no, what about all these other people? And I hope I say this right, the UOCAVA provision.
Avocado.
Excuse me, I'm in the energy business. I can comfortably say I had never heard of it until October 29th, and I still can't pronounce it today. But I am very thankful that the leaders in our state saw that need and recognized it early and made that change to the law. For our employees that were relocated to respond to outages and work to restore power, they were extremely excited when they found out through their county clerks that they were going to be able to vote. The challenge came with the members from the 17 other states that were represented in Mississippi. Thankfully, we were able to, through Secretary Watson and getting names to him, some were able to cast a vote, some were not. And it was disappointing for me. I mean, our company has long been a promoter and a believer in every American's right to vote, that it's an important part, it's in the fabric of our nation and what we do. And so it was disappointing that in that situation there were some who lost that right. But at the same time, I'm optimistic to be able to sit here before you today, share our story, and hopefully y'all as leaders within your states will do a post-review, I'll use our term, post-review after and recognize that you don't always know as a first responder when or where that call is going to come. But that group of people is a very proud people, and they do not leave others hanging. So you don't have a lot of notice, may not have the opportunity to cast an absentee ballot, but through provisions like this, assuring them their right to vote is a great thing. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
And I'll say one last thing, since this is NASS, all of my NASS medallions went to our CEOs of the energy companies that made it available and possible for these individuals to vote, as well as getting our precincts back online. So they made an incredible effort, and I just appreciate, Stephen, I'll tell you thank you again publicly, the work that they did so others could vote, and that was a big deal to us in Mississippi.
Thank you very much, Secretary Watson and Stephen, and thank you, Secretary Watson, for encouraging us to take a look at this issue. And with that, I do want to stress that this isn't just one presentation we're going to do. We're going to take a look at this issue, hopefully get it in front of CSG members as well. And also NASS wants to serve as a resource for you all in this situation. So working with Secretary Watson and his team, I got to speak to some first responder or emergency responders who responded to Hurricane Zeta, and some folks from the co-ops there. And one of the things I heard from Secretary Watson and others is that it's really important in the other states that they know who to reach out to. And that's something we can help with. So, Secretary Watson had to do some digging to figure out, who in the states are the right contacts for me to reach out to be able to help their voters. And so one thing we're going to work on at NASS is trying to create and maintain a contact list. If you have somebody in your office who's the best person to be able to assist your voters when they're in another state during an emergency, we'll have that. And obviously if we don't get one, you can still reach out to us in the moment and we can figure out who that right person is for you. And then the other thing I wanted to stress that I heard a lot is really the involvement of companies like Mississippi Power and their co-ops was really vital. That the voters didn't know that they had that option, and it was having somebody in their place of employment who was able to tell them and able to help them through the process and be in direct contact with the Secretary of State's office. So thank you. And at this point, I'd like to open it up to questions or to secretaries who would like to share your own experiences. Secretary Wyman.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you to the panel. This is really something that impacts my state quite a bit, and I think we have ways around it because we're vote by mail. But as I'm sitting here and listening to all of you, do you think that this is something, dare I say, NASS should take up? It's something that we should be seeking federal legislation for. This raises to the same level, in my opinion, only one member of NASS, as something that this is a national issue, and any one of us at any time could have a natural disaster or an issue that happens right before Election Day. We can't plan for it. And to have something like a UACAVA-like law might be something really good and positive we could bring to Congress, and I think maybe even, dare I say, we might all be able to agree on and universally do. So I'm just throwing that out and just think, I guess my question to the panel is, do you think that's a good idea or something not a good idea?
Yes, and again, it's one of the things we mentioned earlier. The process may be different in each state, but this is a issue that cuts across all party lines. I mean, these are first responders, and so absolutely, that's a great idea, Kim, and perhaps my colleague Maggie and I could work on that.
Absolutely, I agree completely, and let's all work on it together. I'll have a little more time after tomorrow to work on some other stuff here with NASS. So, yeah.
Yeah, Judd, go ahead. Judd, will you use the microphone?
Yeah,
we have
sorry.
participants.
Can you guys hear me? All right. So New Mexico and Mississippi, but then also Taylor, you may be able to speak to other states on this. So, and my apologies, I may just have been not completely understanding the presentation, but if you had a first responder that was not in your state, so let's say they were in Colorado helping with a firefight, doing firefighting around an election, could you, because that's not a disaster in your state, could you have allowed those first responders who have left your state to be able to access those ballots and vote in our state?
I'll say for Mississippi, yes. They don't have to be in Mississippi. They can be anywhere in the country or around the world, obviously, for common purposes, but typically speaking specifically to first responders, absolutely, if they're in another state. And that's what we saw, and Stephen will tell you, one of the most impactful things, it was great to see the excitement of those who were able to use that process, but conversely, it was disheartening to see those who said, oh, wait a minute, I can't vote. That doesn't make sense. So ours covers our Mississippians who are in other states, but other states clearly don't have the same reciprocity. So something we can work on.
Yeah, we're so ours requires either our state governor to have issued an executive order or a declaration of emergency or a national emergency declared by the president. But this is clearly something where we need to expand the scope of our law. So if your state governor, for example, were to issue that state disaster declaration, and New Mexico Hotshot's one of their, we haven't run into that issue so far in managing this provision, but it's a really good point.
This is one of the few provisions where I'm proud that Mississippi is very liberal.
Yeah, it's a good question, Judd, and that is one of those things when we were looking at the state laws that varies by state, where the answer would vary. Other questions, or? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Secretary Watson, I'm all about the logistics. You said that they could get the ballots on their phone, vote it on the phone, and send it back. Do you use an in-house system? What was the method to do it?
Ours is a third-party vendor that we use, but it's via email. Clearly, it goes to their phones. But again, we thought the process with that, and then when you see a hurricane or something like that we see quite often in Mississippi, they're just jumping all around. So it's hard to get pinned down, even delivering a ballot. If you had to take one by hand, you don't know where they're going to be today, tomorrow, or the next day. So having that access via email and using that vendor made it a lot easier for us.
Other questions? All right. I don't think anybody's going to get mad at wrapping up early. Thank you all.